Good morning. Good morning, folks. Good morning. As always, it's very difficult to settle folks down who haven't seen each other for a couple of months. But welcome and thank you very much for your cooperation. We have a very busy morning this morning for our annual kickoff breakfast and our program this morning to open up the 1997-98 school district of Menomonee Falls school year. And we hope this kickoff is better than the kickoff we saw yesterday on TV. I'm sure it will be. We have a very, very busy morning. We have an exciting school theme that we'll be talking about this morning, an exciting keynoter, and a lot of new people to meet. So we need to get started, and I'd like to introduce Dr. Shaw.
Good morning. Welcome to the start of a new school year. I suspect that some of you, even though you don't want to admit it, are just like the kids. You're glad to be here, but you just don't want to tell your colleagues and friends about that, do you? Well, even if you aren't glad, you should be. Because in the schools, at the start of the new school year, we have a new beginning. A chance to do things better, a chance to see our children again, and a chance for new learning. At the start of the school year, we like to think of this opening as a celebration. And today, for our new beginning, we have two wonderful leaders that are going to help us with our start of the year celebration. Joe Greco, who is our village president, is here, as well as Governor Dreyfus, who will be our keynote speaker. Besides our celebration this morning, we'd also would like to talk to you about the chance to make a new beginning. A new beginning, a new commitment to learning. That will be our theme for the school year, commitment to learning. I think we've had some new leadership in the past, new principals, new buildings, new organization. This year, we are poised to emphasize student learning to a greater degree than we have in the past. And I'm asking you this morning, each one of you, to make a commitment to improve the learning of each and every student in Menomonee Falls during this next school year. And then finally, I think it's appropriate at a celebration to reflect on our past accomplishments. We have many in Menomonee Falls. This is a very successful school district. We're in a very successful state in terms of education and in terms of economics and industry. We have a wonderful community, get great community support as we're going to see today. We have many guests from the community who are taking part in our celebration today. And so we have many accomplishments that we can be proud of and reflect on, and we will do that in a videotape that we've prepared, and we'll show that to you as well. So that's our schedule for this morning. At 10 o'clock, we hope that we will have finished the introductions of new staff and that we can begin our commitment to learning for the next school year. Without further ado, I want to introduce the board members that are here today. First of all, we have Karen Nelson, who is our board president. Karen, could you join me up here? We have Linda Kahns. Linda, are you still with us? There's Linda. And we have Jim Hollenhorst, board member. Is Paul Schramka here? Said he might, Paul's in the back. And do we have any other board members here? I want to thank the Board of Education for being here this morning. Karen will do the honors with recognizing Joe Greco, our village president, with a Friend of Education Award.
Thank you, Jim. Good morning, welcome back. I always enjoy this opportunity because this is like a giant pep rally. Everybody comes together and gets this first day kicked off and you're ready to go. So I always feel the energy and enjoy this opportunity to be able to come and greet you and welcome you back. I hesitate to refer to your break as summer because it wasn't really characterized that way this year, but at least you did have a break, and I hope you're renewed and invigorated and ready to go. It is our real pleasure this morning to present a Friend of Education Award to our village president, Joe Greco. We are really blessed that we live in a community which is a friend of education. We take a lot for granted when we realize how smoothly things do run in this community. And it's in large part thanks to the strong community support that we do enjoy. We have strong business partnerships which interact with our school population. We have very strong PTAs in our buildings. We have strong parent support in our PTSAs, in our booster club. We have parents who participate and volunteer throughout the grades K-12. We have an intergovernmental committee which consists of all municipal participants to just talk about what's going on so that we have good communication and everybody knows what everybody else knows. We don't have to waste our time overcoming obstacles. We can spend our time making progress. And it's my privilege for us as a school district to recognize our village president, Joe Greco, with a Friend of Education Award. He truly is a leader who is a total advocate for the school district. He's at every DARE graduation. He greeted our new teachers last Wednesday. He's always a participant in our Student Art Month at the library in March. Joe, as I mentioned, does participate in the Intergovernmental Committee and has constant communication with the school district as far as what he as village president and as far as what the municipality can do to cooperate with the school district to help us to do what needs to be done. So it's with great pleasure that I am able to present this Friend of Education Award to Joe this morning. Joe, why don't you come up now? As I think most of you know who have seen this award in the past, it is what we call a schoolscape. And we traditionally have one of our third grade students create the artwork. But this part is a surprise for Joe this morning. The artist who created his schoolscape is his granddaughter, Marissa Greco. Marissa, would you come up? I would ask Joe to just say a few words, and if you'd also introduce your family who is here with you this morning to share in this.
I sure will. Wow. That is something. A little overwhelming. I'm very proud to be the recipient of what I consider to be the most prestigious award that the Village of Menomonee Falls gives to anyone. Being a friend of education, I believe, should be a given. We came to Menomonee Falls in 1961, which was 36 years ago, and we came here primarily because we had heard, while living in the city of Milwaukee, that the best school district was in Menomonee Falls. And that was the #1 priority that my wife Sheila and I had. And I have observed our school district for 36 years. And we may not be the #1 school in ACT scores, but the one thing we do, and Dr. Shaw just said it, and I hear it continually, We care about each and every child in our school system. And that is why we are unique. I had 2 children go through the school system, my son Joe, my daughter Kim, and both of them are very, very successful in today's business world. I have asked my family to be with me this morning to receive this award. My wife Sheila, my son Joe, and you can tell he gets his height from me. My daughter-in-law, Sarah, and my 4 granddaughters. My daughter is in San Diego on business, so she could not be with us this morning. But we have with us her 2 girls, Rachel and Darian, who, by the way, are also great artists. If you were to go through our home, I think we are the ones that really promoted children's art, because Sheila has taken the things that they have done and put them on the wall. And then we have Marissa and Madeline, who are Joe and Sarah's 2 little girls, both are who here in Menomonee Falls. But I asked them to be with me this morning because I think it's important that I pass on the baton to them also. Because now as they become members of not only this community, but maybe other communities, and our grandchildren start to grow older, I want them also to always remember that education is number 1. In the very competitive society that we're living in today, and we have seen it, even you now are starting to see it. I mean, when I was a kid, a typewriter was a challenge. Today, if you're not on the internet, you're not there. So it's important that as they grow up, they also be part of the whole scheme of educating themselves and their children. I'm very proud of our school district. I want to truly thank the Board of Education for this award, because I really take it very sincerely. And if nothing else happens in my life, this is my pinnacle of my career, and I do want to thank you all and have a good year. And as I told the teachers last Thursday, the new teachers, please teach our children well. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, and congratulations. We'd like to set the theme for this year before Governor Dreyfus speaks by talking about a commitment to learning. So I'm going to ask Harry Stetzel to play the video that we've developed. Could we have someone turn on the lights? Thank you.
Thank a couple of people for the production of that tape. Dave Petroff, who worked with Harry Stetzel, and then some of you have seen Harry here the last couple of years. I think they deserve a round of applause. Thank you very much. Thank you for your patience with our technology difficulties. Thank you very much for hanging with us. I'd also like to recognize in our audience today, we have a number of people we invited today from our PTAs, some local business leaders, government leaders, guests who we wanted to have part of this partnership that we have with our community. And without introducing all of them, if they would just stand and be recognized by our staff. I know we have some people here from Cousins, Associated Bank, PTAs. Would you please stand, please? People in the back. Community Memorial Hospital is also represented here as well. Thank you very much for attending. I'd like to introduce another important Menomonee Falls leader, another Friend of Education Award winner, who has been instrumental in our district in many ways and in our community. Lou Tietz has been so active in our community that it would take me a long time to cite, and he asked me not to cite everything of all the things that he has been involved in and contributing to Menomonee Falls as a community and the school district of Menomonee Falls. But just to highlight a few that I think Lou is proud of, he's been on the board of Community Memorial Hospital and has seen that hospital grow into one of the finest hospitals in the country. He certainly has been a strong community advocate of the growth of Menomonee Falls in the business and Chamber of Commerce areas. He's been involved in our school district planning. He's an original planner from our first district planning group in 1992. And as I mentioned, he was a recent recipient of a Friend of Education Award for all of those reasons and many more as an advocate of education. And then this summer, he was a recipient of a Chamber of Commerce Humanitarian Award for all the work he has done in Menomonee Falls community as a businessman, as a community and civic leader. Quite honestly, our guest speaker today probably wouldn't be joining us if it wasn't for the efforts of Lou Tietz. Lou is a personal friend, long-term a personal friend of Governor Dreyfus, and we've worked with Lou now for almost 2 years to secure the governor, and we want to give him the honor of introducing Governor Dreyfus. So this time, please welcome Lou Tietz.
Thank you very much, Keith. It's really a pleasure to be here today. And if it took getting the governor here, well, I'm grateful for that too. Welcome to everybody here. This is just a tremendous turnout, and I'm very pleased to participate. It's been my pleasure, as Keith has said, to know the governor for quite a few years. More than that is an honor that he has extended his friendship to me, which I cherish highly. There's little I can tell you about him that he hasn't already posted on all of those big boards known in Wisconsin and throughout the United States. But his world started in academia. He had been the chancellor at Stevens Point for some years. It was there that I first heard him, not in the role of an academic, but he spoke to a political convention. And I learned more about the politics of Wisconsin from a man who was not involved in them at that time. His quick mind, his observation of the world about him, but more importantly, his futuristic attitude at that point in time made me want to know this man more. In the business world, I learned to know him more frequently, serving on a board together. His tenure as governor was a remarkable one. He inspired ideas, and he continues to inspire ideas, having recently served, ending his term as a regent for the University of Wisconsin system. There's so many things I could say, but you want to hear him. And with that, I introduce you to Governor Dreyfus.
Thank you. Thank you, Lou, and I'll not touch this. You see, we had a rule at the university that you need here. Never let PhDs touch the equipment. I am delighted to be here. I wasn't too sure about the audience when I came in. I've got ties older than some of you people. And I wanted assurance that they really were all teachers and staff. But I'm delighted to be here simply because, first of all, Lou Teets, my association's out here. I'm thinking certainly with Joe Greco, whom I've known for quite a while, but Clarence Dittmar and Jim Hazard, there are people all over. But more importantly, possibly than all of them, and would be for them too, Dick Klug. Now, for new people to the community, that's not a name that means anything to you, and he's gone now. But Dick was the reason I came out and joined the FM Bank Board. My son, who is an attorney, now a judge. You may have watched him a bit in the Oswald trial. He was the sitting judge. Lance Ito could have learned some things from Lee Jr. But quite frankly, he opposed my being on a bank board because there are some very real risks. But there are always risks in public service, and that's the key factor. And Joe, I'll tell you right now, something else that's happening with your children and your grandchildren. They see that example that you give something into the community. You're willing to stand either for public office as you have, and that's only one way, or whether you do it in community organizations. There's a heredity to this, and it's social. My family were German draft dodgers who got here in the 1847 period. No, this whole state was essentially founded by draft dodgers and enemy soldiers. I told that to the American Legion right after I was elected, and they didn't invite me back. But it's true. It's true. 6 brothers that came out of southern Germany, and isn't it strange, avoiding military under a Habsburg prince, 3 of the 6 wound up fighting for Mr. Lincoln. Very different, you see, being a rental army for a Habsburg prince as opposed to fighting for freedom and something they believed in the period to preserve this union. And it's in that kind of thing that you've started. But in my family, I tell you, somebody in the Dreyfus family, or Dreyfus, they were originally Dreyfuses, somebody in that family has been involved in some kind of public service literally from day one. We've had postmasters, we've had justices of the peace. My mother, for example, there's a book on Women of Achievement, Wisconsin. You can pull a chapter out of there. There's a whole chapter on Claire Blewett Dreyfus. 24 years on the Milwaukee School Board, president of that board in the mid-50s when they fought some very tough battles. She was very anti-busing, and John Reynolds, the federal judge who ordered it, John and Patty lived right across from Joyce and myself when we were in the veteran village outside of Madison, 33 miles outside. They didn't have any room in Madison when we all came back from the war to go to school. And so she had known John very well. But John and I were talking, we happen to be neighbors now again up in Door County, and John was saying, he's remembering some of the things that Mother argued back there in the 50s and early 60s. One, she was the first state president of the Wisconsin Congress of Parents and Teachers. And very important to her. She probably, I would say that except for very new schools, and there aren't that many in our inner city in Milwaukee, she inducted and trained all the officers of the PTAs in every one of those schools. She believed in that because education was absolutely her drive. And quite frankly, she had told John, she said, I'm telling you, if you cut this cord between home and school, you will reap a whirlwind. And John has thought of that often. Well, the other thing, too, good practical German Hausfrau, she understood what they were dealing with. When they started talking about busing the kids around, she said, look, you got a basic problem, real estate problem, and rather than let the parents move, you're going to move the kids around. That was her view. And we watch now that experiment, what it's produced, and black parents all over this country are beginning to rebel against it, and that whole issue that it was producing as a way to solve key problems in our society, and it's absolutely critical that we solve them. And I'm convinced we will. I'm convinced that's why we've been gathered together. I'm not going to get into that theme, but the 2 key problems that divide people are race, ethnicity, and religion. We've solved religion. You may not be aware of it because you're all so darn young from my point of view, most of you in my children's generation. But when I came home from the war, First of all, I'm a 20-year-old lonely sailor, and Joyce took advantage of me. I want you to Well, I hadn't talked to a woman face-to-face in almost a year and a quarter, okay? And I get 9 houses down, and she's the first one I run into. But in the process of looking at that whole run and what's changed, we had a major problem, believe it or not, in getting married. We'd known each other since 5th and 6th grade, or 5th and 6th years of age, in the very first years of school. In fact, I can honestly say my wife's the only person I ever truly disliked in my life. When I was about 10, I absolutely would have punched anybody in the mouth telling me I was going to live with her, and that's been the biggest break of my life. But you know what our problem was? She was Irish Catholic. I was German Lutheran. Major, major problem. Couldn't be. Which is kind of dumb. To be a German Lutheran, you just have to have German heritage, be able to sing loud and memorize. If you can do that. Listen, it's even easier to be Irish Catholic female. Just be Irish and have guilt. That's not a problem today. Today, if 2 young kids will get married, parents are so damn glad they'll take it. Any church, okay? So understand, we have solved that. They have not solved that in Belfast yet. They have not solved it in the Middle East yet. You can just move across the globe. But because of satellites and television and computers, I tell you, this thing is now interconnecting. I was on the Trinity College campus in Dublin. We were chasing Joyce's ancestry. And one of the history colleagues there, for whatever reason, had told them about the fact that we were a mixed marriage. You know, we haven't thought about this in at least 4 decades. And that's all those young people wanted to talk about. They really had troubles accepting that we lived in the same block, that our parents were friends. They were all at the wedding. There was St. John de Nepomuk, and one of your maintenance staff people is out of that school, lived in that block. I just met him at the coffee. That we had a Catholic church, there was a Lutheran church, there was a Methodist church, there was a Presbyterian church, all within walking distance, nobody shooting anybody and nobody bombing anybody. And finally, one 22-year-old co-ed from the adjunct college, she said, well, if the Irish over there are the same as the Irish here, then this does not have to be. Bingo. That's the gift we've already given, and that's the function, I'm convinced, for this country. We are not here by chance. I'm absolutely convinced of that, and I won't push that too hard, but I'm convinced he has gathered us together to be a research and development lab for the globe. We're only 5% of the world, and that's about what any industry puts into R&D. That's what he's put into R&D. Well, if you don't believe me, watch the opening of the Olympics. Now, we had 3/4 almost of the people on the globe watch the Olympic opening. Just think of that. Between 3.5 and 4 billion people. And when you watch those teams, if you watch those African teams when they hit the track, they look like African people. If you watch those Asian teams, they look like Asian people. If you watch the European teams when they hit, they look like European people. When you get down to the bottom of the alphabet and they call off the United States of America and that huge team hits the track, next time you think of this, look at it and try and scan the faces as best you can. Then ask yourself a question. What does an American look like? Now, that's a question that's been being asked, literally for a decade and a half all over the world. But we've been blind to it because we don't understand what our key element is relative to the rest of the world. Just 3.5 years ago, Chief of Staff, Joint Chiefs, most powerful military position on the face of the earth, changed hands. And the outgoing Chief of Staff handed the baton of power to the incoming Chief of Staff, and you people didn't even pay any attention to it. You didn't blink. Believe me, the rest of the world saw it, because they saw a black man named Powell handing that baton to a man named Shalikashvili with a Georgian, Polish, German accent. Now, that's a vignette that can only take place, as of now, in this part of the world. It can only take place here, and it's going to spread. Because, see, America is no longer a place, in my opinion. America's now an idea. It's an idea, and I tell you it's moving, but it's going to move on the feet of the children, and they're going to move on education. I did come from a family where education is absolutely critical. My brothers and I didn't have any choice. We were grown men. We came home, we got married. That didn't mean a thing to my mother. We were going to the university because there was a GI Bill. It was that simple. I'm fifth generation Wisconsinite. I'm the first person in my family to come out of the university. And I'll tell you, that peasant German great-grandfather, in his wildest dream, wouldn't have thought that somebody from his class would get to be a professor or a university chancellor, let alone a governor. In fact, my brothers and I are convinced if my mother had been alive, she would not have approved my becoming governor. Seriously. To give up a professorship and a university presidency to be governor, in her opinion, step down. No question about it. And understand, too, the part of it was because she had to struggle to get through South Division High School. Going to school nights when she was working days, or going to work nights when she was going to school during days. Because her father died when she came out of 8th grade, and her mother needed her income production. It was that simple. Also, her mother was a German immigrant woman who did not understand even why she wanted a high school education. What for? That isn't what God created you for. Kinder, Kirchen, Kuchen. My grandmother believed that. Well, that was a genuine belief on my grandmother's part. If you can raise your children, serve your husband and home, and serve your church, that's what God created you for. You do not need to go to high school to do that. Never understood why my mother wanted a high school education. And that's that thing is gone today. Our problem now is, how do you keep these youngsters who don't understand they're going to go down the tubes if they don't stay with it? Well, academics and coming out of it, my teaching level, 28 years of it, and I taught every year that I was president of the university. I taught every semester, held a seminar in my office. Even when I was gone, I had it wired so that I could deal with those 12 students by electronics. I missed only one class. I was chief of mission for higher education in Vietnam. I had taken on the job. In fact, that's the reason I became president of the university. I went from professor to president. I hadn't been a dean or a vice president. As a faculty member, I viewed all those people as mice studying to be rats. And suddenly I was offered this presidency because a friend of mine, Jim Albertson, died in Vietnam on that educational survey. And I then had to talk Joyce into letting me go up there, take his job, and build those universities in Vietnam. I intended to come back to my satellite and communications research in Madison. I can remember Joyce sitting out in the Antlers. It's a little place just north of Stevens Point, and sitting there crying, saying, "This is a place you drive through. You don't live here, you know." And then she fell in love with it, and I had troubles getting her out of there. Al Lewandowski is our city clerk for a zillion years. Mark Lewandowski, and his father is August. That's an old Stevens Point family. By the way, Stevens Point's the oldest Polish community in the United States, second oldest, I'm sorry. And it is still about 72%. And up there, when they say surf and turf, they mean carp and kielbasa, right, Mark? No, as a result of that community, I built a branch in Kraków, Poland, and that's where I got to meet Cardinal Wojtyła. And then he came over and he was my house guest for 2.5 days. Right in the middle of my campaign of '78, the one cardinal I know in the whole Roman Catholic Church gets elected pope. Now that is political skill, anyway you look at it. And knowing him didn't hurt in this state. Over half the people believe if he tells you go to hell, he can make it stick. So, and all of the film of his visit, I was right in the middle of. The real issue, and I see it with myself and I see it with Joe. We are no longer part of a vast majority, particularly grandparents, who have access to grandchildren. Joyce and I live in one of these cemeteries with lights out on the end of Waukesha. No, in fact, we're the flower children of the group. I mean it. And I'm already 6 years beyond statutory senility. So, as far as we know, in our condo village of some 63 families, there are only 3 others that have grandchildren in the Waukesha school system. And that's posing a major part of our educational environmental problems today. Has much to do with the teacher passion, has much to do with the tax problems. We just had a referendum in Waukesha, one in part a very dumb administration and school board attempt. They did not communicate to the people on what they needed, and it got voted down 2-1, bad precedent. But they locked to it technology. And that's where that bothers me. Because I see technology as absolutely where it's going, whether the schools like it or not, and you need to get into it, and I hope you're into it absolutely in aces and spades. We need the equipment, but they also need to train our teachers, because some of them absolutely fear this. And by the way, if you fear being replaced by TV and computer, you understand, from where I come from, any teacher who can be replaced by technology should be. Just that simple. Any teacher who can be replaced by technology should be. You are not purveyors of petty accuracy. Okay? And I was one of the worst offenders. I had a midterm exam. I taught a large lecture section, Ag Hall, about 550 students at a crack. And my doctoral and master's candidates were the only ones who really had any close communication with the students in quiz sections. And I had a midterm exam which the students affectionately referred to as the bomb. 12.5 seconds per answer. You know, multiple guess, the whole routine, because I wanted them to have a lot of data. That's the background we all come from. That's what the computer's unmasking. In fact, I'm a perfect example of that. I was born and given a very good storage and retrieval system. And that's what we have always honored in education. And I got all the head feathers to prove it. Magna cum laude, 5 years of college with 3 degrees, Phi Beta Kappa Key, PhD, you name it. Because I could store and retrieve faster than my brothers or anybody else in my class most of the time. Quite frankly, the computer's unmasking that. In fact, we've turned such data control into a game, Trivial Pursuit, which is making a lot of money for Banda Publishing up at Menomonee. Now, it doesn't mean we shouldn't have any. But as things change, for example, we practically eliminated memorization. I don't know how many of you require it. By the way, I said I was raised Lutheran. I'm telling you, I'm serious. You could not get salvation if you couldn't memorize. You had to stand in front of the congregation, spit it all out. Not sure of the value of that, but I am sure of the memorization skills. Maybe that's athletics of the mind. Because I worry. We've created machinery and forklifts and all that, which replaces muscles. Now, one of the negative side effects of that is we've got a lot of coronaries, and most every American working to take off weight. You know, Joyce has probably, in our 50 years of marriage, I'm sure she's lost 500 pounds. I'm serious. You name it, she's tried it. There is no kind of diet that she hasn't tried. See, she thinks it's not fair. Men get heavy and gray, and they're called distinguished. Women get heavy and gray, and they're called heavy and gray. But machinery has done that. Look, in fact, we may live longer, but there's no question. You absolutely get out of shape. I'm losing my mobility. I'm glad if one end of me or the other has to go that it's the bottom end, but no matter how, it has to do with the fact that we don't walk anymore. I just had my grandson, Lee 3. Our 3 grandchildren just 2 blocks away. The judge and his wife lived just over outside the village. And he calls me from football practice. He's over there practicing and pushing and so on, really getting into this. Starts freshman year high school. But he calls me because practice, there was a thing that was cut. Would I come and pick him up? I said, excuse me? First of all, I get the call collect, because they have to use I said, you're 1.1 miles from home and you've just been exercising. That's 17 times across the football field. As a matter of fact, my high school coach, a guy named Blackburn, if you were out for a sport, you could not ride any bus or streetcar at all. You could only ride in your parents' car. Any place you went, you had to walk. He saw that as part of the run. It's kind of weird that when he calls me and said, will you come and pick me up after he's been out practicing for football. But it's part of what we're doing with the system. And as I try to relate to my grandchildren so that I can be related to you, and that's why I say people like Joe and myself, it's unfortunate families have scattered, but you people are all over the darn countryside. You know, you're the most nomadic generation ever in the history of this country. And the next generation is probably going to scatter the world. We've got a grandson now in Mountain View, California, in the computer out in Silicon Valley, 27 years old. September 5th, we're going to get our first great-grandson. They sent us a sonogram on the email, and Joyce, I couldn't make heads or tails out of it, but Joyce showed me where the head was and explained why it was a boy and so on. I don't know, they've been married now 6 years. We were still playing Vatican roulette, so I don't know what they've been doing at that point. But this is part of the shift culturally. And the question is, we will be too far away from that child to have direct influence. Fortunately, we've got direct influence here. Because as a grandfather, I want to know how can I affect my grandchildren. And I've happened to have gotten in. I found a way, by the way, to make teaching pay out on the national circuit. And in the process, have been able to do some things for grandchildren that I wouldn't be able to otherwise. So what did I choose to do to mesh with what you do? One, I put a computer in both of those homes 15 years ago. Big IBM PC. That was a huge piece of machinery, since updated and smaller. All 6 of those children handle that equipment. Now you say, well, there's pornography on the internet. You bet there is. I tell you some pretty wild stuff. I've looked at it. And right now, our library in Waukesha is struggling. How do you deal with that? Well, you've got some programs that can intervene, but any really smart kid is a good hacker will get around that. The only real solution, I think, for that, both in school, you may want to look at that, Shaw, both in school and in library, is put the equipment that has access to the internet in a very visible, high-traffic area. That's your best solution, where there are constantly going to be people walking by. Now, maybe if they're gym teachers in Waukesha, you may want to put some restrictions. Put it in a high visible area so that people are walking by all the time. Now, besides giving them computers, I put a piano in both homes early on. All of those children are into music. I've been trotting them in and out of art galleries up in Door County. And about 8 or 9 or 10, that individual taste starts to emerge. And then each one, as they hit 12, could buy a piece of artwork that they wanted that I would pay for. In fact, the youngest one, Claire, we have another Claire Bluette Dreyfus. She's the 1984 model. My mother was the 1894 model. She really stuck it to me, I'll tell you, on an oil painting. It's gorgeous, but it had a hefty price on it. The third thing I did is and Joe and I have talked about this before, I've taken every grandchild wherever they want to go in the world. Well, you know, you're talking about a $5,000 bill, and $5,000 be gone in a heartbeat. No question about it if you leave it to them. But that, and the key thing I get are 9, 10 days, all by myself. And Joyce doesn't go along, just myself and the grandchild. And I get 9, 10 days with them, close contact. The 2 older boys both wanted France. They since each lived there a year in their high school years. They're both conversant in the French language. In fact, the middle one, who wants to be an ambassador, or thinks he does, he's spent just the last year in Paris, studying on a program out of Georgetown, which is highway robbery. $31,000 a year tuition. Can you believe that? Pat Lucy, his youngest brother Greg is the president of the Jesuits. So I called Greg and I said, what's with this $31,000? I said, I've been a regent of the university. I know what the education costs. And I could see where you can argue 12, 13, maybe 14, but not much beyond that. And he said, okay, Mr. Supply Side. He said, we got 1,250 seats and 14,000 qualified applicants. How would you price that product? So at least I understand why. The problem is that they've got access to all the ambassadors, and that's where people want to study. And so Christopher's out there, and he's met a marvelous young woman. They're going to be married in June. Her father, Nikki Papadopoulos from Greece. Her grandfather's in jail over there, by the way. A few of the historians may remember he was the Colonel Papadopoulos who led the coup and was premier of the country for 7 years. And then when the socialists got in power after they turned it back to democracy, they tried all of them, condemned him to death, and then commuted it to life. And they'd let him out of, it's house arrest, it's not a jail. They'd let him out if he'd sign a paper saying what he did was wrong. And if you think that old Greek's going to sign that paper, forget it. Because he believed the communists were going to take over, and he was obligated as a career military officer to prevent that from happening. But when I look at those two young people and their experience, she was in Madrid at the time, we conversed regularly on email. On email. You know, it isn't even costly, it isn't time consuming. My grandsons, none of them very good at writing. But once it's on the email where they can just immediately punch reply and type something up, that's where it's going and that's where it's heading. So on that score, that's how I see myself in helping my children get ready for the 21st century. I also happen to be on the EAA board, and I've offered to pay the cost of learning to fly. So far, only 2 have taken me up on this. And this 13-year-old, little Claire, she's the next one. She's absolutely going to do this. And for a while, I was worried because of these yutzes that had this little girl, and they wind up dead. Pure publicity, and that's not what it's all about. But I am convinced flying gives you a sense of freedom and motion that you can't get any other way. And if I can add that to their dimension, I absolutely will. But there are new forces for you, and I jotted some of them down. Obviously, the mass media, they've been around, because they were in your childhood too. But technology, and I'll tell you a third force is my age group, the affluent elderly. And by the way, all this talk about fixed income and so on, the fact is this elderly generation of Americans are the most affluent generation ever in the history of the world. I listen to people my age and north saying things at public meetings that sometimes I'll go to get up and Joyce is kind of pulling on my coat, but I've got to take them on because they got short memories. No, we bought our homes in 4 figures. You can't even buy a good car in 4 figures today. In fact, I went big. My father was upset with me. When we got out, I finished my doctorate work in '52. I go over to Michigan. I paid $11,200 for a house. My father thought that was outrageous for any good working man. And I had a fixed mortgage for 4% for 30 years. $67 a month was my entire payment. Now, grant you, I was high paid because I was getting $5,000 a year for the 9 months. But I looked on that as a pretty hefty income. So I agree, we weren't earning the same money, but the point is that we had that aspect into property ownership, and then every time you upgraded, until I wind up in a condo that I think they just assessed. Now, somehow Joyce found an 8-room condo. I didn't even know they existed, but leave it to the Irishmen to come up with one, I'll tell you. But all of that, I don't really have that in it because of this escalation, and each time we sell a house. And you get a little more mortgage. I remember when I got a full professorship, and I came in at big money at Madison 62, $19,400. I'm serious, that was a good salary. That's the year I became a feminist because I came into my first executive committee meeting. I'm 35 years old, full professor, Mr. Hotshot in my own mind. I come into my executive committee meeting, and one of my very favorite professors, and anybody who had anything to do with speech at Madison would know the name Gladys Borchers. And Gladys had retired that previous June. And I'm looking down the list of salaries, and here's Gladys Borchers, whose thesis was 1927, the year Joyce was born, and she retired at $9,600. I'm coming in at $19,400. I went up, I said, there must be a typo, and I found out there was not. She was single female, doesn't need the money. That was standard. Well, these things have changed. My school time, and I'm convinced we probably had the best cadre of teachers. You've got a standard to measure up to in the 20s and 30s. And the reason was they were almost all single females. And they had no other function in life than teaching children. They weren't allowed one. You were either a wife and mother, a secretary, a nurse, or a teacher, period. That's it. So it doesn't take a genius to figure out where the best and the brightest of those females went who weren't going to be wives and mothers. And my generation had the advantage of all that. And I'm serious, really an advantage. I didn't need 5th or 6th grade. I could read when I was about 3. I could always play piano. These were gifts given to me. And my father used to hammer that home to me, that I was going to be the smartest kid in my class. I could do all these things my brothers couldn't do, but I needed to understand those were gifts. I had nothing to do with it. I couldn't even be proud of it. Now, he wanted me to understand. I didn't do a thing for that. That was handed to me. He said, what's going to be determined whether you can be proud of is what you do with them. And when you get upstairs, he's going to ask you, what did you do with the talents I gave you? And for whom did you do it? Those 2 questions have guided my life. They guided my children. They're guiding my grandchildren. Wise advice from a father who letter-wise never got through high school. No, I look back now on my own education. And that's why I say technology that can replace a teacher should, because I had teachers that could not have been replaced by any piece of technology yet devised or going to be devised. Everything was to skip you ahead. And my father would not permit that. He said, I don't care what you do with them, but you can't skip them. Because he was concerned I was going to be a high school senior, I was going to be 14, 15 years old. Socially, I was going to be out of whack. The gals are already ahead of the guys. Why put that kind of added barrier in? And he was right. I wound up as my student government president at Washington High School. In fact, Joyce didn't vote for me. She voted for Newton Minow, the other guy. Yeah, whatever became of him, right? Newton's done pretty well. But when I look at that situation, I couldn't have done that. I couldn't have been a class leader. That kind of leadership wouldn't have been allowed to a 15-year-old as a high school senior. Age is too important then. I didn't even date Joyce because she's a year younger than I am. We didn't date juniors, big deal. But that's just part of the game. Fortunately, I had a father who said do something with him. I had a 5th grade teacher who would then, in her case, I studied nothing but ancient Rome. And the 6th grade, ancient Athens. They'd give me the bus pass. I'd go down to the office, get the bus pass, get on the green bus. This is the edge of the bus line, Townsend Street School. It's now Sherman Boulevard and Fond du Lac. It's no longer quite the rural edge that it was. And I'd take that bus all the way downtown to the Milwaukee Public Library. I suppose, one, you wouldn't be allowed to do that today. No question about it. That's what's changed in this. And they had everything set up so that I spent my time learning about those 2 cultures that whole year. Then I wrote a play about it, produced that play using all of the kids. They tied me up for 2 years. But the point is, as a professor, I'm absolutely, there was no question in my mind. I was a classics professor. Why? Miss Ross and Miss Erdman. Just that simple. Same thing with the high school. I was talking to one of the high school principals here. Because people say, well, boy, in our day, didn't have all of this nonsense going on. That's right, we didn't. And we had a guy named Balzer, and one of my friends was shot down over Germany near the end of the war, and he spent time in a Stalag. He said, I thought Balzer was running the place. We were not allowed to talk on the 2nd floor. When you passed in class, you had to stay inside the terrazzo strips. You get a 9th hour. Balzer wouldn't last 6 months today. Why? Because he had something that these principals today don't have. You know what it is? Absolute backing of the home. It was absolute. It was unquestioning. With my big mouth, did I have troubles in high school? You bet. Did I tell my father I had trouble? Not a word. Because if I told him, I had 2 troubles. He made it very clear. He sent me there to go to learn. He did not send me there to teach the teachers. Very, very clear. I had an old battle axe English teacher. I do a weekly column. I just wrote about her in the column. Miss Ines Strom, and Miss was a title, like Admiral. Absolutely on my back. And I remember a paper I got back was a B+, and I'm looking with my friends, and one of them had an A-, and I'm reading their stuff, and there's no question in my mind, my stuff's better than theirs, and they thought so too. So I went to see her. And I told her that I thought my paper was better than hers. It was on Scarlet Letter. First of all, she wasn't happy with my smart aleck title, which was The Red Badge of Courage. But she said, I said, my paper I think is better than theirs, and they do too. She said, I do too. I said, you do too? I said, well, then why have I got a B+ and Marlo has an A-? Because I expect more out of you. And she said, I'm telling you right now, you're not coasting in this class as you have in some other classes in this school. You want an A out of me, you better get to work, mister. Never forgot that. This was a lady who believed that the English language was a precision tool to be used like a scalpel, not like a meat cleaver. And I've been grateful to her ever since. She's had great impact on my life. And when I get to that great blackboard in the sky, she'll probably be around, and I'll check with her. Because I owe her a lot. I can list a whole bunch of people. I have absolutely no talent in art. I mean, I'm terrible. And we had in 8th grade, we had 1938. You got to carve a horse. You bring a bar of ivory soap, and you kept the shavings, you took them home. And I'm carving this. I've got a thing that's got a body, head, and 4 legs, sort of. I mean, the only hope for me is that I'm a latent primitive. And Miss Dorothy Meredith was the teacher of art. And I remember doing that dumb assignment. I thought, this is really dumb. You know, I'd rather have outlined sentences on the board, or let's have a spelling quiz, or let's do math problems, or whatever. But I have to carve this horse. That's 38. 1968, Tet Offensive. And I'm chief of mission for higher education in Vietnam. And we lost our Minister of Education, so I go shooting over there to get him replaced and try to get some things stabilized. And I'm in country a couple of months, and I'm really tense and tired. And in that process, I finally decide, that's it. I'm not going straight back to the university. I'll come back through Europe. And in those days, as long as you kept going forward, $5 more, you could stop anywhere along the line. And once I paid the private price personally down to get to Bangkok from Saigon, and it's the same distance, so I could use my ticket. So I come back through Europe, and I get into Rome, get over to the Vatican. For the first time, I see the Pietà. I'd seen this in an art history course. But now I'm standing there, and it's about from here to you. And quite frankly, no plastic, anything. It was wide open until some nut took a whack at it. Now you have to stand back and view it through plastic, and you name it. But quite frankly, I'm standing there looking at this thing, which is absolutely impossible. You cannot do that to a rock. But you know, for that moment, there were 2 sculptors involved, Michelangelo and me. Because I understood from that darn horse what kind of hand, eye, and mind it must have taken to do to that rock what I was looking at. I was so moved by that, I went back to the Cavalier Hilton and got a note off to Dorothy Meredith, who was then a professor at UWM. Got a note off to her and said, Dorothy, I just saw the Pietà. I now understand that horse carving assignment in 1938. Thank you. By the way, I got back to the university. There was a note from Dorothy, said you were always a slow learner, but I knew you'd get it. You are now dealing with 18,000 new hours of television. Clearly, you've got many students who have much more influence from television in time than you have access to them. You got 365 new films a year. That's one a day that's coming out. 25,000 new books a year. Just reading the titles would be a task. 65 million newspapers a day, 8,000 radio stations, and 20 million people already on the internet, as has been mentioned before and as Joe mentioned. You see, it was the age of information. You are not teaching children in the age of information. You are teaching children now in the age of interconnection. It's an interconnection thing. And literally all over the world as it just expands beyond anything. Now, what are the possibilities where you've got a single source? And we talk about all this growing diversity in the country, and there is racially and ethnically, but not culturally, because in fact, sooner or later, all those subcultures get assumed into the main culture. Take a look at the music nationally across racial ethnic groups. Take a look at the dress. Take a look at who are the celebrities. And you get an identical listing. And we've moved from, we do not honor people of achievement anymore. We honor people who are celebrities. I said I was on the EAA board. We had there Chuck Yeager, first man to break the sound barrier. Very courageous act. And quite a guy. We had Frank Borman, one of the first men to walk in space. We had the 4-star Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force. And I go down the line with others. So we had some people who have really achieved and contributed in aviation. But who took over the whole blasted place, the media and everything? John. JFK Jr. And some woman says he's a real hunk. And I wouldn't have minded that out of a 19-year-old, but out of a 69-year-old, So I complained to Joyce, and she said, well, he is a real hunk. I would want to see him too. I said, why? He hasn't contributed anything yet. That's all right. If there's no question in her mind. Spacewalkers, sound barriers, and so on. If she had a choice, she's sorry she hadn't gone with me and meet JFK Jr. It's just part of the game that we're in. No question about it. And it's the thing I am concerned about, and that's where parents, grandparents, and you, and the reason your role has increased is because, as I say, grandparents are no longer related. They're so busy chasing warm weather or off to winter for 3-4 months, or else the kids have moved somewhere else. As I said, you're the most nomadic. So we don't have it, at least in the mainstream culture. Same thing is happening with elderly homes, and no question in my mind. I froze all of the nursing home beds in this state. In 1981, they're still frozen. I wouldn't let them build anymore. They were so proud of this. We were really a humane state, second in the nation in nursing home beds. Until I looked at the data, and after all, I've spent a lot of my time as a research professor. I was chairman of graduate studies at Mass. I spent a lot of my time analyzing data. And I look at that data, and what do I see? Title 19 I'm talking about, so we're not talking money, okay? Title 19, government's paying for this. Very few black elderly. Very few Hispanic elderly. Very few, if none, Indian elderly. No Asian elderly. Almost all Caucasian. And that told me something. Those cultures still keep their elderly with them in the home. And that's just changed since my childhood. I only had one grandparent. Now as I look at her, fortunately, she didn't, wouldn't, or couldn't speak English, which forced me, at least as a small child, I have some German in my background. I mean, her Bible was in German, and if German was good enough for God, it's good enough for her. But as I thought about it, if there had been a time when I was a child where they said we're going to send Grandma somewhere else, that would not have made sense to me. Because my notion of family, you see, particularly in the Depression, was a large group, an extended group. And I finally realized, particularly in the main Caucasian culture of this country, we were beginning to warehouse our elderly. Get them somewhere where somebody else is responsible to take care of them. I think that's part of a problem when it comes to the children. Children can gain much, and we've got to find ways to bring senior citizens, as they're called, back into the educational process. They're a marvelous resource. Where my grandchildren have gone to school, obviously, they tag me at 4th grade to come and discuss the governorship and what it is in terms of state government. And I've learned some things, too, in the process. I learned it in teaching in church school. I have great respect for what you do, particularly those of you in elementary school, especially around that 5th, 6th grade on through about 9th. I was a 6th grade teacher at St. Andrew's Church School in Madison, just up from the Camp Randall, and I must have set Christianity back a century. Because I finally resorted to absolute threat of physical violence. No question. You're going to sit down and shut up or else. So that for me as a university teacher, if somebody wants to sleep, go ahead and sleep. Somebody wants to quit, go ahead and quit. You make too much noise, get out of my class. Now, on that score, particularly those of you who are public educators, see, the advantage of being a parochial school teacher or a private school teacher is you don't have to take every student. You are obligated under the law, Article 10 of the state constitution, to provide this for every single student in the state. And that changes the rules, because you've got some students, and I think you're fortunate here in Menomonee Falls, you probably don't have a lot. You don't have the problem we've got in Milwaukee and those teachers. They've got some students who dare them to teach them something. They defy them to teach them something. And that's the place where we need to put our greatest effort and our greatest resources, and hopefully we're doing that. But I am concerned that we create a transistorized mind from all of this mass media. You know, it's all pre-printed circuits, all interconnected, everybody coming out with the same answer, and they believe in the experts. I mean, the President of the United States talks to us, and that isn't enough. You've got to have some experts now come on and tell you what he just told you and what it meant. You know, Eric Clarified gets on the air and tells you, here's what the president really said. Think about it. Your job, the only citadel of defense, I tell you, against that is the human mind, and that's where you come in. You can create those individuals. Otherwise, they will become like Detroit-made parts, totally separate but totally interchangeable. And wouldn't that be a terrible thing to do to any society? That's the key thing about, and I think it's a hallmark of young Americans all over the world. They're quite individualistic, and getting more so, because I think now this technology is returning us more and more to the individual. They can deal on an individual basis. And on that basis, your job is to defend that kind of mentality. This American eagle, that's a nifty symbol. My own favorite is out of my own ethnic heritage, out of Goethe, when he said, Die Krähen fliegen im Schwarm, aber der Adler fliegt allein. The crow flies in flocks, but the eagle flies alone. And protect those eagles who want to be alone. And don't destroy them. Especially, I think the greater problem is on the male side, and usually around 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th grade. Because sometimes individuality gets to be a pain in the tush in the classroom. I understand that. We had problems with Lee Jr. We had the same problem with Lee 3. They tend to be a little talkative. They get that from my wife's side. One of my favorite true stories in my family is Lee Jr., the judge. He's about 8 years old, 7, 8. He lives in a female world. He's got a female teacher, his mother, an older sister, his Sunday school teacher's female, and males at that point, particularly in that generation, lived in a female world. And he was taking them on at every turn. And it's very important at age 8 for a male to be right. And he'll outgrow that by about 92 or so. And he was taking Susan, his older sister, on about the name of Tonto's horse. They're standing at the foot of the stairs, her bedroom upstairs. I'm home from the university. I'm sitting there reading a paper trying to stay out of this. Joyce is preparing the meal. That's one of these little, 46-foot lot, and when we bought this house, 450 of them, they're all alike with 5 different fronts, so you better stay sober when you go home. But he and his sister are arguing about the name of Tonto's horse. And he insisted the horse's name was Prince. And he would always substitute lividness and volume if he didn't have fact. Susan could not remember Tonto's horse's name, but it was not Prince. Yes, it was. Joyce couldn't remember the name, And she knew it wasn't Prince and came out. She said, "You make this kid admit he's wrong." I got nothing to do with this. Well, Susan just left the field of battle, walks upstairs, and in the process remembered the horse's name. And she shouted down, "Tonto's horse's name is Scout." My wife came roaring out of the kitchen. "That's right, Tonto's horse's name is Scout. Now, make him admit he is wrong." And Lee Jr. looked over at me. He knew the horse's name was Scout. He's beaten, defeated, crushed. I mean, this is it, Armageddon. And if his school teacher and his Sunday school teacher had been there, they'd have said, "That's right, Lee. Tonto's name is Scout." But all of a sudden, that beautiful individual mind went to work. He lit up like a Christmas tree, and he said, "That's his last name." Please, don't beat that out of a 3rd, 4th, 5th grader. You people didn't play mumbledy-pig when you were kids like my generation with a jackknife. Now they carry them for other reasons, but we always understood you have to leave some piece of ground to stand on or you don't have a game. And that's true, I think, with the human mind. Now, when I look at where we are on the plus side, especially here with Menomonee Falls, we don't want a national system of education, but we don't want that is so fractionated. Families expect, if they get moved and transferred from Menomonee Falls to New Jersey or California, that they're going to come out of your schools and plug in. There may be a few variations, certainly on state history, but they're going to plug in. And there is now, I think, with this world connection, a possibility of world tribalism. I hope not. But I already see it as I travel the world, and I've been fortunate on that basis. I can see it in Japan clearly, because I got there as a teenager. When the war ended, they moved us in first for occupation. And I can see it in Europe. I'm telling you, Japanese teens are more like American teens, certainly, than they are like their parents or grandparents. In fact, a Japanese 20-year-old female is not 40 years from her grandmother. She's 400 years from her grandmother. It's absolutely moving, all because of communications. Now, that technology of computers, and goodbye, Mr. Chips, now has a whole new meaning, I think, for teachers. Teaching and storage and retrieval is, in fact, I think, doomed. Not to be eliminated, but it's doomed as the hallmark of what you do and what you produce. But information is to use rather than to know. Therefore, in many cases, it is serious, as long as you know where to get it. Because now, any of you that have chased the internet, chasing a subject, is just incredible. When I think of the hours I sat in the stacks, those musty stacks, up in the old Hysterical Society in Madison, which they used for the library, compared to now, to have been able to just surf through articles, pick out what I want. Unbelievable. We've eliminated memorization. I think you should somehow figure a way to get at that. My wife came back to school as a 45-year-old and graduated at 50. She had had 58 credits and then pulled out of school with the birth of our first child and never went back. But then she decided as a 45-year-old she'd go back to school and swear I was chancellor. So, in fact, when she graduated, I stopped the commencement and said all those rumors about sleeping with a co-ed were true. But Joyce went out for theater. She's very good at that. And she would have that book, the whole play practically memorized within a week. And she had a group of college students come to her one day and said, "Mrs. Dreyfus, could you teach us how to memorize?" And she came over and talked to me and said, "How do you teach somebody to memorize?" Never thought about it. I didn't either. But these were students who'd made their way all the way into collegiate level education and had never memorized a single thing in their life. And I do think that that's a mental skill that has value, and it certainly helps people to get things ordered in their mind. Because while I don't want to denigrate writing, I think it's very important. We are now in an oral tradition. We're right back to where the Greeks started us from in Aristotelian times. We're into an oral tradition. Marshall McLuhan predicted all of this. years back. Marshall and I had a very close association. He was up in Toronto. I was down in Detroit at the time. I had a television station he could come and play with, so he was down there pretty regularly. Listening to Marshall was like drinking from a fire hydrant. I mean, you got a lot, but boy, a lot splashed around you. But clearly what he saw in all that's really survived is the global village and some of those concepts. But right now, when I look at where we are on this information and how much of that to pass out to youngsters, I still think you need to at least approach these youngsters. You know, in a sense, I wish we had a machine that you could take all those kids, put them in the machine, and you'd get to see what they were going to be 30 years later. Or more importantly, what they could be. Think how that would affect you. I'm not sure there'd be some minuses to that too. But I've asked high school graduates, if we had a machine that you could go dial up and see what you were doing 30 years later, would you come and look? And most of them said no. Because obviously getting there isn't the trip. I got all kinds of titles, but they all have the word former in front of them. You know, I envy these youngsters. It's all laying out there in front of them. And I'm glad I didn't know all of that. I could not have possibly done that. It's a good thing. And those of you who are guidance counselors, be careful what you're telling these youngsters. If I had gone to a guidance counselor as a 17-year-old and they said, Lee, what do you want to do? Well, first I'd like to be a manager of a radio and television station. My father was in broadcasting, and I'd like to do that. But then after I do that, I want to become a professor in that area at a major university. And after I do that for a while, I'd like to be a president of a university. And then I think I'd try politics and be a governor. And following that, I'd like to run a corporation for a while. Now, you know exactly what a guidance counselor will say. Now, look, young man, you're going to have to start focusing. You can't do that. Be careful what you're telling youngsters. By the way, this next generation of students, and before I left the Regents, I had two things in mind. One, to make sure that every classroom, lab, dormitory, library, they are all fiber optic wired, prepared for interconnection, and I want every dorm room to have 2 plug-ins because those youngsters are bringing their laptops. And I want to be able to get that library, any library in the system, including the Library of Congress. That's where it's going. That's where it's going. And as we do all of that, we are ready for this 21st century, and you need to move them in the same direction. Because we're going to get into those who are prepared, those who are well prepared, and those who are unprepared. And we think we've got a gap between haves and have-nots now. I'm telling you, the gap is going to be far greater because of technology, except for one possible intervention, and you're it. You're it. My grandchildren are not going to have a problem. They came from a family that could afford to put good computers in them, including Nintendo. That's okay with me. If it takes a game to get them into the equipment to handle it, that's fine with me. But I tell you right now, unless we get at, in this society, those who cannot put that in the home and find a way either to do that or get them so intrigued so it's available in the schools. And the next step after the technology, and I'm working right now, I've just told our school board in an article, ignore the vote of the people. First of all, I didn't have that many vote. And there is no such thing as a referendum that doesn't take 2 or 3 shots. I said, your task is to get information out. You never overestimate the knowledge of the people and never underestimate their intelligence. It's an old political rule, and it's got to apply to all of you in the school boards. You have to get the information out if you want the people to support it. And now I want them to go at it again. Not on this new building thing. I think they really messed that up. But on the technology issue. Because we've got to prepare these students. I know what's waiting for them at the university. All of our universities. And you simply have to give people the knowledge and go at it. The next step is you train the teachers. And I don't mean some of the teachers, all of the teachers. Help them. And especially down in the lower grades, because more and more you're going to have youngsters come in who do have access to that kind of equipment at home. When Claire said to me she wanted to go to London, and by the way, one of the rules of traveling with me is they had to learn about where we were going and tell me what they wanted to see. So we didn't just travel. And I expected them to tell me all about this as we traveled, and they did. I got pretty good. That's kind of nifty getting it through 13, 14-year-old eyes. And almost all the places we've been, I'd been before, but I tell you, you see it differently. But she downloaded London off the internet. My son was a little upset when he got that bill. Yeah, there's a lot on London. But in the process, she read about the Channel under the English Channel. So she tagged me one night when we were over, stopped at the house, and she said, "Paka, do you think we can go to Paris on the Channel?" I said, "Well, if that's what you want to do, we can give up a couple of nights, and I'll look into that." But I said, "They've been having some terrorist problems. Let me check. We may need a visa to do that." She said, "They let kids have credit cards?" By the way, we took that night tour of light of Paris. You know what she came out of that with? She's trying to figure what kind of a tour could we set up for Waukesha. And then she was saying, "But we don't have all of the nice things they have." And I said, "Well, that's not a fair comparison." She said, "I know it's bigger." I said, No, it isn't just a matter of bigger. I said, if you want to compare Milwaukee, which is big, with Paris, I said, then you're going to have to compare what Paris was like about 150 BC. Because Milwaukee's only 150 years old. I said, you're not comparing the same thing, and I can tell you what we've got in Milwaukee is far greater. It isn't even in the same ballpark compared to what Paris was at its same age and development, and that made sense to her. But she's since been working out a bus tour that you take to get a tour through Waukesha. I'm waiting. I think she's going to have a little marketing problem, but... There is the anti-tax crowd. They've always been around. That's not new. But you do have to worry about moving the elderly who start to vote against schools. And you know why? Because they don't live where their grandchildren go to school. And then I even hear, well, we supported ours now. We ought to be free from that. And the question I ask everybody my age who says that is, did your grandparents support the schools when you were in school? Simple question. Simple answer, and they know it. Very strange, but the key problem there is, one, as I said, the elderly are affluent as a group, and they like it. 2/3 of them own their own homes. They don't live where their grandchildren go to school, and since property values and taxes went up, and by the way, school taxes are going to go up this year in Wisconsin. Just in the paper this morning. Now, I don't know, and elderly are worried they don't know how long they're going to live. I mean, Joyce really, she has two almost neuroses. One is that she'll outlive me. That's really a concern for her. She figures she just couldn't possibly do that unless, after 50 years, you kind of get used to each other. The other factor is she's concerned that while my feet are going bad, she didn't want her head to go bad. And we hear a lot about those things. We're pushing it. And especially Alzheimer's. But as long as that's the case, the other factor is, in most cases, elderly don't want to live with their children, but children tend not to want to have their elderly move in and support them. Put them on Title 19 and transfer all the property ahead of time so we get our inheritance, and then let the taxpayer, that's their neighbors, support them. To me, that is basically immoral. And in fact, I tried to do something about that when I was in office and failed, and it's getting done now. I think we are making that kind of movement of property. You suddenly become indigent. Now somebody else has to take care of you, and you've dispersed everything. That's not what it's about, and we ought to stop it. And I'm hoping legally we can put an absolute clamp to it. Political power. You people, as part of the MFEA, you're part of WIAC. And by the way, some of you who've been around a while will remember Maury Andrews. Maury goes under the knife next week at Johns Hopkins for cancer. And if you had any kind of a personal relationship, now is the time to exercise it. Maury and I really got along very well. He called me in to talk to the union leadership at WIAC. And the first thing I told him was, quit trying to get bigger and more powerful. You should start getting smaller. Well, I had their attention. They just saw that as absolute nonsense. And I said, no. I said, you do not have the support of the general broad-ranging public. Why? I said, the key reason is they don't believe that you are absolutely a guarantor of quality teaching. That you will, in fact, go to court and support a lousy teacher and keep them in their job. And that's hurting you. I said, why don't you do what the old trade unions did? I said, my father was anti-union. But I'll tell you, when he had to have some wiring done in his home, or he had to have some carpentry work or some plumbing, he got an AFL union master tradesman. Because the union in those days, that AFL trades union, and I think it still does today, they said in effect, if we tell you he's a master electrician, he is a master electrician and he will wire your house properly. And that's where I think it has to go. Albert Shanker, now gone, and I used to see Al out on the speaking circuit, and he's absolutely convinced of that. In other words, teachers judging teachers. Because that's the best group to ask whether a teacher is a quality teacher or not. And you have trouble with that. I had trouble when I was president of the university. I brought the faculty money in, and I said, here, 70% of the money, disperse it any way you want. What are you going to do with the other 30? I said, well, frankly, I'm going to come back and ask you what to do with it, but this 30% of the money can only go to 10% of the faculty. Ooh, they didn't like that at all. No, we're not going to do that. That's divisive. I said, okay, but you understand, if you don't, the juniors and seniors on this campus and I will, along with the deans. So that's your choice. Which devil do you want? Then they finally decided they would prefer faculty judgment. Because it's got to be. It's got to be in every single profession, and that's what you are. You are not line workers. It'd be nifty if you were assembly line workers, but then we'd be back to those Detroit-made parts. And you know as well as I, every single student comes through your classroom is different in some respect. And as a professional, you have to deal with that difference and make sure you don't stifle it. So my own opinion is that we ought to look at becoming smaller, not larger, because you understand, once you got in the political arena, you got to take all the negatives that go with that. You know, it's not a piece of cake out there. Politics quite different from academics. The only function of the opposition is to make you look bad. I had troubles with that. Joyce hated it. She hated politics. I'd have stayed 2 more years if they hadn't changed the term length, but I couldn't have put her through 4 more. Her migraines were scaring the devil out of me. Quite frankly, that's just part of the political process. It shouldn't work, but it does. It's the best we've got. And yet, you know, if Moses had been faced with that, what they would have done is they'd have compromised. Part the water halfway and swim the other half. It's simply part of the game. You can't let anybody really win. And when you got into the political arena and you start supporting one candidate and the other guy wins, hang on to your hat. You can't expect him to say, man, do I love you guys. That's just a price you have to pay, and that decision is going to be looked at because you've become the most powerful organized political force in the state. Much more so even than AFSCME, because you can turn them out in the Capitol. And I do worry, as now the state has taken over, another force. I opposed that because I wanted local control of schools. And I know how government works. There's the golden rule of government. He who has the gold makes the rules. Simple. And it's going to happen more and more. We will eventually, I suspect, get a Secretary of Education, eliminate DPI, and the elected superintendency, which at this point is just a dispersing mechanism, but talk to any of the superintendents, they'll tell you, get more and more mandates, most of them unfunded, more forces now telling you how to run, and that's why it's got to come back to the teacher. When you close that door and you're in that classroom, I tell you, you've got something you can't get anywhere else, and all the rest of that you can just ignore. So my advice to the administration is let the teachers teach. First advice. And I know that sounds oversimplistic, but get them out of as much as possible, David, of all of the other garbage that we now require, and unfortunately, most of it getting required out of Madison. And you've got to come up with the pieces of paper. It's great. We're the largest paper producing state in the country, and I can believe it. Computer was going to eliminate paper, remember? Absolute nonsense. As far as the union, become the seal of quality. Not bigger, but smaller, and frankly, start throwing some teachers out of the union. Say, you don't measure up to our standards, you're out. I tell you, that will radically change public support for teaching. And parents, and you've got strong PTAs. You have no idea how fortunate. Wherever my mother is, she's smiling. PTA was so critical to her. And that needs to be redone, although I think PTA needs some reorganization. They've got to start becoming more representative government in style so that home mothers, non-working mothers, can be representing, say, 2, 3, 4 other mothers who can't make all the meetings because they are working. And that's possible to organize. And then they get on the phone and say, I was at the meeting last night, and here's what they said, and here's what they said about Janie, blah, blah, blah. I think that's going to be the new run, and I'm hoping to sell PTA nationally on organizing in that direction. As far as students, do I think we need busing in this country? You bet. We need busing to separate the disruptive students who interfere in the educational process and put them in one joint. Because I am convinced, well, I think any teacher can handle a disruptive student. But once you've got 2, then they are capable of interfering with the education of all the rest. And it's at that point the society really has a right to say, that far, we are not obligated to deal with this youngster. That youngster is now hurting the education of all the other children in this classroom. And as a teacher, I am not going to stand for it, period. And the force is going to come from you, and then through your administrations, your school boards, and eventually your legislators. And as far as teacher training, I tell you, invest in every, particularly K through T teacher, to recognize dyslexia. My son has some data when he was juvenile court that they could measure, so they know it's not a full amount. 35% of the delinquents facing the courts are dyslexic. You see, the problem starts K, 1, 2, 3. They can't read. The teacher tells them to try harder, which is utter nonsense. It isn't there. Then the other kids are making fun of them. Then they tend to associate them with the kids who don't like school like they don't like school. There's a whole cycle. And finally, by about 7th, 8th, 9th grade, you've got an absolute dropout mentally and a major problem. And we are learning more about dyslexia. And I think what we need to train in our K through 3 and early childhood is be sure they can absolutely spot it. We need to create diagnosticians. It's not your job to solve it. That's a major professional task. But to be able to spot it and say, hey, we got a problem here. Because I was president of Century Insurance Corp. That's a $7 billion corporation. The only thing I missed from that, by the way, is the private jet. It's like being an Arab, you know. The chairman of my board, John Jonas, absolute brilliant man, dyslexic. He wound up getting through law school, memorization, somebody reading for him. He wound up as a command navigator, 8th Air Force. He wasn't willing to be cashed out. And he winds up as the chairman of the board of a $7 billion corporation. In fact, anybody that we had on campus, any student who had any dyslexia problems, we always set up a luncheon with John. And then John would kind of embarrass this youngster with some of their limits on spelling and so on. And then he'd say, okay, now try me. And in short order, they realized this guy who's got the whole world from their point of view is just like I am. He has dyslexia. Here's what you can do. And that's what it takes. But we need those of you in K3 to be able to spot and say, hey, somebody's got to help this youngster, or they're going to be a problem 6, 8 years down the line. The key investment, I think, will be computer literacy. It's going to dominate the 21st century. We need teachers now as never before because we've got so many mothers working. My daughter-in-law, Susan, my son married over his head. She is really something. But she is now responsible for child welfare for the entire state. Tommy asked her to come and do that. She commutes to Madison. They've got a 13, 15, 17-year-old. They couldn't do that without a family decision because Joyce and I are involved, particularly in moving them around on occasion with lessons and so on, because her time, and certainly the judge can't control his time. You get a trial and they have to lock you up till midnight. On that basis, we need teachers more than ever before. Because this next generation of Eagles, I tell you, are critical, not to this country, but to the world. The world expects us to lead. They expect us to, for the reason of exactly where I started. What does an American look like? And every person out there on the end of that satellite, I tell you, watches something like the Olympics, and they say, hey, there's somebody who looks like me who is an American. That's what changed the rule. I mean, you think the African continent, they don't know that notice a Joyner Kersey, or they don't notice a Carl Thomas, or an Edwin Moses, that they look like they do? You don't think on the Pacific Rim they notice that Christy Yamaguchi or Michelle Kwan looks like they do? Of course they do. Of course they do. And that's the difference. That's how they relate to what this country is. And they're going to be looking for it. And that's why you need to create these eagles that'll fly alone. And one last prediction I'll give you, as I sat down thinking of what I would have loved to have said, okay, let's do a 3-hour seminar in small groups, and I wish I had the time. See, I'm still working. You marry Irish, you got to work all your life. Joyce says you can't have that much fun for free. That's why they marry the Germans. They exploit us. Society is placing a premium on knowledge and information like never before. And as such, and this is a prediction I made 15 years ago, and I'll repeat it because it's beginning to happen, proprietary and commercial invasion of education, and it's happening in aces and spades. There's money out there, and they're going to move in on it. Already are, because information can be sold, it can be brokered, it can be traded, it can be bartered. We are in this age of interconnection, but with it, the age of the individual returns. And I really think, from my point of view, as I envy my grandchildren, how I would love to be their generation instead of mine. And I mean that seriously. Because a new Renaissance man and woman is possible to come out of this. And this country will lead the way. Because when you talk about the combined synergy of all the human minds in this world, what an incredible computer that would be. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. And you are part of it. Because the next time you see the pyramids on the TV, think about this. Cheops time, the Great Pyramid, 4,300 years ago. If you're an evolutionist, 4,300 years is a blink of an eye. If you're a creationist, then you know that human beings were created with the capacity we all have. My whole point is that the men who built those pyramids 4,300 years ago had this intellectual capacity and capability of landing men on the moon or anything we're going to do in the year 5000. All they lack, and all they lacked, was the knowledge. And that's the business you are in. So as we look at it, will you keep in mind, it is your task for the world to raise these eagles up, to motivate them to go after that knowledge so they can help provide this world leadership. So next time somebody asks you what you do, please don't tell them you're a teacher. Tell them you raise eagles. Thank you.
Governor Dreyfus, thank you so much. You are really a treasure to have.